reminder to those of you online, if you do have comments or questions that you'd like us to address, please get them sent in. I do have a few from this morning that we'll be addressing later this afternoon. And reminder that at the end of the session, if you'd like to get up and speak again, we will be, assuming there's time, we'll be basically calling you up here and having you stand in line and have your second shot at either asking questions or providing comments to us. So with that, we're going to resume with the public comments. So Sue, you want to call them up?
Yes. I hope Annie Pham is here from Sierra Club. Annie? Okay, we'll move on to Anna Mascarenas. Is she here? Okay, sure. Bill Greggs. Is Bill Greggs here? Okay.
Okay, I'll tell you what I'm going to do, Sue, since people didn't seem to take me seriously. Maybe I should have said if you're not here when you're called, you don't get to, well, we won't do that. But I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to switch the order of the agenda a little bit. And so I'm going to read the comments and questions that were submitted this morning by email. And then we will try again. Okay, the first email is from John Katz and Lisa Dipko, pollution prevention coordinators from US EPA Region 9. And their question is, can you explain how the public will be informed of A, priority chemicals, B, chemical product combinations, and C, changes made in products as a result of alternatives assessments? As we discussed a little bit this morning, the regulations do require DTSC to post a lot of information on its website. And that includes the listing of chemicals of concern, including the initial list and any additions to the list. Also, the product chemical combinations. There will be the proposed list and the final list made available to the public on the website. In terms of changes made in products as a result of alternatives assessments, this information, I think, the public will be able to gain these through two sources. One, the redacted versions of the AA reports, which will include the decision, will be posted on the website. And also this information, I would imagine, would be contained in the regulatory response determination notices that the department posts. Okay. Next email is from Kathy Godfrey. She's, I believe, works with Borns. And she has two questions. First question is, we are an electronic component manufacturer. We do not sell directly to the public. Our products are not sold in retail stores. However, our parts, trimming, potentiometers, chip resistors, etc., are used by computer, cell phone, appliance, and many other manufacturers of electronic equipment. While our customer electronics manufacturer customers, HP, Dell, Apple, Motorola, and others, may ask us for information regarding materials used in our components for their consumer products, how will this rule affect us? Providing material information of our components to our customers is not new, as European RoHS, REACH, ELV already require this of the electronics industry. But a clarification of how this regulation will affect companies like ours who do not manufacture products that alone are available to the consumer would be helpful. So I think the answer to that is that potentially we might, there's a twofold answer. One, if the product priority listing is a product component chemical combination that, for example, this company manufactures, then they would be responsible for providing the priority product notification and the complying with the alternatives assessment requirements. If, on the other hand, we name a product that contains one of their components, and the manufacturer of that product needs to know what's in that component so that they comply, then they would be requesting this information from their supplier. And, you know, I guess their leverage is if their supplier does not conform, then they would have to do their own testing or perhaps look for another supplier. So question number 2 from Kathy Godfrey. Let's see. some potential chemicals of concern may be hazardous as a raw material. In a finished state or incorporated into a matrix, they pose no hazard or offer no exposure pathway. An example is brass. Brass may contain contaminant levels of lead, but items made with brass do not have the same exposure pathway as raw lead or lead powders or paints. Some materials such as zinc and magnesium are hazardous in dust form, but in a finished product they are not present in dust form. Will the state of chemicals in a finished product be considered and the potential lack of exposure pathways? And the answer is absolutely. Considering the potential for exposure is a major part of the prioritization process for products. Okay. Next question comes from Gary Velasek, and Gary is with Intercontinental Chemical Corporation. Gary is referring to section 69502.2, Chemicals of Concern Identification. You provide a great number of lists of chemical references that are not necessarily easily assessed. You are likely to add more chemicals as chemical concerns increase worldwide. Many lists require memberships in organizations or information companies that lead to extra costs and expenses for small businesses especially. By incorporating by reference, you're referencing chemicals not readily available to the public as should be properly and easily seen within your regulation for public domain consumption and review. So the question posed is this: since you are stating these references in your regulation, why not permit these to be reachable within the regulation's digital format in the public domain as hot links, which would make immediately available the complete contents of each list referenced in your regulation? So I'm not sure if under the APA process if that is actually something we can do the way it's suggested, but we do plan to make this information available in other ways, including I imagine that we will be posting links on our website to these lists, and we will be providing the informational list that's referenced in the regulations that lists all of these chemicals. And I think part of the way we're formatting our list is not only are we listing the chemical, but we will be listing the source lists or lists that a particular chemical is on. So we will ensure that this information is available in the public domain. So I have one more. It's quite a long one. So I'm thinking, let's see if we have enough people back from lunch to go to our questions.
Start with Annie Pham from Sierra Club. Please be here.
Okay, that's better.
Hello, my name is Annie Pham, and I represent Sierra Club California. And I would like to start by thanking Director Debbie Raphael and the rest of DTSC staff for all the hard work that's put into this. We do have a few brief comments today, and we'll submit detailed comments later. First off, we are concerned that the definitions for adverse environmental impact are too narrow, and we would like to see the list of chemicals of concern to be as comprehensive as possible, and for it to include not only chemicals that have negative impacts on human, but also the environment. In addition, we feel that by having the flexibility to have an alternative approach to the alternative assessment, it may require more time, and the quality is unpredictable and might create unwanted loopholes. Also relating to the alternative assessment, since certification programs will not be effective until 2015, we are concerned that what will happen in the meantime. Lastly, we feel that 2 to 5 priority products just simply not enough. Our members are going to want more, and we understand the lack of funding, and it is something that we would also like to address, but we would like to see more see things happen in a more timely manner. Personally, I do not want to fight the same battle that I'm fighting right now for my children when I'm a grandmother. So, well, thank you for the opportunity to provide these comments.
Thank you, Annie.
Okay. Anna Mascarenas. Anna is with Physicians for Social Responsibility, Los Angeles.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for having me here. My name is Ana Mascareñas, representing Physicians for Social Responsibility in Los Angeles. We're a 4,000 strong physician and health advocate membership organization in Southern California. At PSRLA, we are pleased to see significant health protective steps taken in this informal draft regulation, but we still have serious concerns about the program's implementation and overall effect it may have on the health, environment, and economy of California. We agree with 3 of the major changes that determine exemptions to this rule: removing the unintentionally added exemption, the no exposure pathway exemption, and closing the loophole that would allow a manufacturer to avoid an alternatives analysis simply by removing the chemical of concern once it's listed as a priority product. However, as health advocates, we are concerned that the current de minimis level in this rule will not capture certain chemicals of concern, particularly endocrine disrupting chemicals, which may harm the health of all Californians. Also, while the new regulation states that worker health will be included as a prioritization factor, it is very difficult to find exactly where. For example, throughout Article 3, workers are not even referenced as a sensitive subpopulation. We'll be submitting much more detailed comments on this draft, but I would appreciate if you would consider 2 questions today, both of which focus on the health and welfare of vulnerable communities in California. 1, we would like to know examples of products which might be manufactured in but not for sale in California. This regulation would exempt these kinds of products as currently drafted, and we fail to see how these kinds of products would not, in fact, affect workers especially and fence-line communities in our state. Also, when a product with a chemical of concern is phased out, how can the state make sure that the old formulation, which may or may not have a consumer label, simply isn't just dumped into discount stores, swap meets, or dollar stores, especially in low-income areas? Thank you very much for the opportunity to comment today, and I look forward to submitting full and more detailed comments. Thanks.
Did you want us to take a stab at responding to your questions?
Sure.
Okay. So your first question on examples of products manufactured in California but not sold in California, I have to confess I personally don't have an example. Jeff or Cora, do you have any off the top of your head? No. So we'll see if we can get some examples for you.
Okay.
So your second question, if you could.
Sure.
Okay.
So
when the product is phased out, how do we know it's not being dumped in discount stores or elsewhere? And so that really is, you know, it's part of the overall how do we ensure compliance with the regulation. And it's going to be through our enforcement program. And I imagine we will have to, as resources permit, have some sort of a secret shopper network. And I would also expect, based on past practices, that there will be persons out there who have that kind of concern who will kind of be doing some sleuthing, and I know that they will file complaints with us when they discover something like that.
okay. Thank you for your responses, and they're both along the lines of ensuring environmental justice and the regulation, so thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have Bill Greggs from Grocery Manufacturers Association.
Good afternoon, folks. I'm Bill Greggs with the Grocery Manufacturers Association. I think, as you all know, GMA was a supporter of the legislation that undergirds these regulations as it went through the legislature, and we've continued to support green chemistry all along. There's 3 areas I think that I want to talk about today. One, some things that we support in this draft, some concerns, and a couple of questions. So first, and I'll just mention a couple of these. The idea that DTSC mandates the question, but then doesn't dictate the answer. I think that's a good approach to follow. It sort of allows for sort of a self-implementation, self-determination by companies in where they're going to go on that. In the first round, the idea that DTSC is going to focus on 2 to 5 products and chemicals. Again, I think that makes sense. It's kind of a let's learn by experience. Doing that is going to trigger lots of stuff, as I'm sure you realize, and we can learn through that experience and move from there. There's a number of things in the alternatives assessment that have been mentioned by some others, and I'm not going to bring up right now. The idea of no requirement to fill data gaps, but DTSC can come back for those that are critical. I think, again, that's a real make sense approach. And the idea that this will focus on consumer products and it's not about commercial products or bulk chemicals is, where the statute, I think, tries to take things. In the area of a couple of concerns, Paul DeLeo talked about this issue of thresholds. And I've got serious concerns about the fact that neither OEHA nor DTSC address thresholds for any of these measurable hazard traits. If you think about it, any measurable hazard trait, Paul mentioned persistence and bioaccumulation, but that's true for immunotox and a lot of other things as well. They're measurable, and so they're non-zero. And so if I don't have some kind of a limit or threshold, then I don't know really where the problem is. I think if you picked a chemical that was a chemical of concern in a product for persistence, every single other component in the product is going to have some non-zero persistence, including water. And so I think the thresholds are really something that are going to be important to address. On reliable information, we've talked about reliable information, I think, on many rounds of these. There's clearly some improvement, I think, in this draft on reliable information, but I still think at the core of it, the idea that published information automatically is reliable information, is not workable. What happens when there's 4 published reports on a particular topic all coming to different conclusions? You've automatically said they're all reliable. Well, how can they be reliable if there's 4 different conclusions? So there really has to be some additive on that. We've offered some suggestions in the past on these issues. The third area really is on the chemical concern list. I think on that one we'll offer some detailed input, but some of the lists we agree with, and actually that we've recommended to the department in the past as authoritative lists. Some we don't think are appropriate. I think, the idea of, okay, so let's take the right lists and then merge them together, that makes some sense from the idea of identifying a list of chemicals for consideration. But I think doing the approach that's offered now really will create a mess. I've been working on trying to figure out what the chemicals are. I'm well over 4,000 chemicals at this point. And there's all kinds of items on those lists for which I don't have the breakouts yet, bismuth compounds and others. I think we're going to be headed toward 5,000 very easily in terms of actual chemical cast numbers. And even with the right list, though, there's this issue of things on the list. We end up with oxygen, nitrogen, aluminum, iron. There's over 450 pesticides on this, well over 4,000 that I've identified. There's scores of pharmaceuticals. There's lots of, and those are out of scope, of course, with regard to the legislation. There's things like that are, how do you dimension them? Sulfates, color, viruses, even coffee is on the list. I'd venture to say that a large proportion of the room, had coffee. I saw a lot of cups coming into the room today. Thank you. So I think that there's some work that needs to be done to start with something larger as consideration and do some narrowing and focusing to create real chemicals of concern. I think that can be done. I appreciate the department's issue that you don't want to get involved in something that's going to take a year and so forth. I think that there's some ways, and we'll offer some specific suggestions on how to start with that larger sort of chemicals of consideration, but then let's narrow it down to chemicals that we really ought to be paying attention to. Someone mentioned screening, and that's kind of the thought. I think that there's some ways to do some screening that can get at that. Finally, 2 questions I wanted to ask about. One is, once it's selected, is that product type a priority product forever?
Well, I would say yes. And I would say that, at some point in time, everyone who's manufactured that has done an alternatives analysis. Now, when you ask that question, what comes to mind is, are you contemplating that somebody new might put a new product that falls within that priority product listing on the market? Is that
Well,
where you're coming
thinking about
from?
the notifications. There's notifications and re-notifications and re-notifications when significant changes are made. You're going to be hearing from a lot of people from a long time. I mean, I'm thinking about, I saw a list the other day, I looking at something else, and I saw a list of, of people who make beauty products. It's over 1,300. And these are just people that have signed a particular pledge on beauty products. It's not all. So, I mean, I'm thinking when you trigger over 1,000 companies having to notify you, and then re-notify, and then re-notify, and then re-notify when there's changes, it seems to me there's a diminishing return, I guess, in this issue that needs to be considered.
Okay, well, I guess we'll have to, I'm not clear on the scenario you're talking about, but so let's talk about it and
Okay.
figure it out. There is a process by when we can remove a priority product from the listing, and so maybe that's the answer.
Okay. And then the last one was there's a requirement in the alternative assessment about looking at any chemical of concern in the product as a part of the AA. And what I'm wondering about there is, so if we've got well over 4,000, maybe 5,000 chemicals of concern, do I have to test for all 4,000 to 5,000? Or can I do a desk study, in essence, of I know what materials that I'm buying. I've got raw material specifications for those, which include limits on contaminants. And so through that desk study, if you will, I could come back and say, I don't have any others, or I have these 3, they're limited by raw material specifications at such and such levels and below de minimis. So I'm wondering about, is it really, are you really anticipating a testing for 4,000 or 5,000, or are you anticipating people would do an analysis based on what they know about their raw materials and their product process?
That's a really good question. I think I want to think about it some more before I give you a definitive answer. I think part of that answer may be along the lines of what we talked about data gaps, because I think requiring testing for 3,000 or 4,000 chemicals might get to that concern about really extending the amount of time to complete the AA. So it's a good question, and I think we need to put our heads together and talk about it.
Okay. Thanks very much for your attention today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Next, Maya Jack, Grocery Manufacturers Association.
Good afternoon. I'm Maya Jack, Senior Manager, Science Policy Chemical Safety at GMA. We represent food, beverage, and consumer product manufacturers within the U.S. And as you heard, we've been engaged in this process since 2007. We're also members of the Green Chemistry Alliance. So I actually intended to come here and ask clarifying questions and not necessarily go over, you know, our standing position is that we support risk-based prioritization and assessments. But I wanted to dedicate this time and hopefully get some answers or clarification on some of these questions and concerns that I picked out from the regulations. Now, on the topic of alternatives assessment, there are a number of positives worth noting. The flexibility of the alternate process, giving the manufacturer the ability to use the most appropriate methodology and tools to do their alternatives assessment, trying to hone in on the most relevant factors, also making it more effective in terms of the assessment, and allowing the manufacturers to actually make a self-determination as to the most appropriate alternative to use within their business model and context. However, some of the concerns are, and this, I guess they all do fall within the alternatives assessment umbrella. It goes actually to the first part of the regulations on priority product prioritization. And there does not seem to be any indication as to limiting the number of chemicals of concern that the department could identify as serving for the basis of designation as priority for a product. So let me rephrase that. It doesn't sound as though it would be limited to a single chemical of concern used as a basis for designating a product as priority, that the department might have the flexibility in identifying a handful or more. And so the concern is that the scope of the alternatives assessment that would ensue could actually become so large that it paralyzes the effort from the outset. And I'd be interested to get the department's view on that.
Well, you are right. The regs definitely set it up so that we might list a product or a product component because of more than just one chemical of concern in there. I think it would be very unlikely that we would list, that the basis for the listing would be a whole bunch of chemicals of concern. And, you know, if you look at the narrative standard that would be the basis for the listing, you know, I mean, it would have to be those chemicals for which there's the highest concern relative to the adverse impacts associated with the chemical and the highest concern relative to the potential for exposure to that chemical in that product. And, you know, I do recognize what you're saying about the more chemicals of concern that are listed as the basis, it increases the complexity of the alternatives assessment, so.
Okay. Okay, and then on, so the other, actually I have a number of questions, so I don't know how long you're gonna give me, but anyway, in terms of consumer acceptance, in the stage 1 of the alternatives assessment, it speaks to as a first C the function and performance, but it doesn't explicitly state consumers' acceptance as a criteria for identifying viable alternatives. And consumer acceptance is critical in product development and really drives what product is to be formulated. And so we feel that consumer acceptance should be an upfront consideration prior to any further analysis and should be explicitly mentioned in stage 1 of the alternatives assessment. Here's a clarifying question on legal requirements, the way it's been defined and the way it's referenced. It speaks to requirements, legal requirements for products. And the question is, why is chemical not included in that definition? And the reason why I raise this is because if we're looking for viable alternatives, if it's a new chemical, it would have to comply with, for example, EPA's pre-manufacturing notification. And how's that accounted for?
Okay, well, it sounds like a good point that,
Okay.
frankly, we hadn't thought about, so
Okay.
thank you.
Okay. I'll skip that. Well, maybe a clarifying, just trying to pull out some understanding as to why I think this was in the second stage, maybe, there's a reference to all chemical ingredients known in the priority product and having to identify those in the second stage of the alternatives assessment process. And it was part of the multimedia evaluation or life cycle evaluation. And the question is, why are all chemical ingredients being pulled into this, not limited to chemicals of concern only?
Well, in a general sense, you know, the statute requires the comparison in the alternatives assessment to compare about 13 different factors, some of which are relative to the chemicals, between the product and the alternatives. And you can't really do that without knowing what the full list of chemicals are.
Okay. Okay. And then let me see. 2 more questions. Okay. So on certified assessors, is to be, okay, under responsible charge. Okay, so the alternative assessment is to be performed under the responsible charge of the certified assessor, which is what we heard this morning. The question is the responsibility of the certified assessor. Is that person going to ensure that the process has been followed for the alternative assessment, or is is your thought that that person would have to assess the validity of the information that's included in the report submitted to the department?
Well, the certified assessor would be in charge of the entire process.
So it's not necessarily the case then that they have the expertise, because in product development it's multidisciplinary with multiple experts, and so the
Well,
certified
you could
assessor
have
would
more
be-
than one certified assessor. So we are running way over, and
Okay.
I'm
Okay.
accommodating that because I want to
Okay.
provide responses. So
Okay.
if we can
One
quickly
last
do your
question.
one last question.
Okay, one last question is on the alternatives assessment work plan. In the regulations, it talks to giving us 60 days for the alternative process, that we can submit an alternatives assessment work plan within 60 days, but that work plan, and this is a point of clarification, that work plan, does it have to have the same kind of information that the AA preliminary report would have to have? And if that's the case, then why is the time frame different? 60 days for the work plan versus 6 months for the preliminary report?
I have to confess I'd have to look at the details, but I do not think it would be the same amount of information. But we will go back
Okay.
and check that.
So
So that's a
thank you.
good question.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you. Those are very good questions, and the questions are helpful, I think, for all of us. And so I think we're doing okay time-wise. So I am trying to allow more than 5 minutes when you're asking questions, because that's only fair to allow time for me to give you feedback. But if we start running short, I may limit the number of questions. So we'll just see how this plays out.
Thank you, Odette. Next, we have Joe Gregorich from Toy Industry Association.
Good afternoon. My name is Joe Gregorich. I'm Director of State Government Affairs for the Toy Industry Association. TIA has over 500 members that represent toy manufacturers, distributors, retailers, and inventors. I want to begin by thanking you guys for taking the time today and over the next month to address this really important issue. For the toy industry and our members, toy safety and product safety is our #1 priority. We've over the last several decades, spent a significant amount of time developing toy safety standards and worked with government, consumer advocates, and medical experts to do so. And a lot of these toy standards have been addressed and made federally mandatory in the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act in 2008. Two issues I just want to bring up briefly right now that we would like to bring up, and these will be in addition to our more detailed comments that we'll submit at the end of the month, are on product prioritization. When developing regulations, DTSC, we urge you to provide clear definitions of contaminant and intentionally added for products. And then after doing this, must establish a consistent de minimis for contaminants and provide for a due diligence system. The reason we're asking for this is, as the state of Washington and the state of Maine, in developing the Children's Safe Products Act in Washington and the Kids Safe Products Act in the state of Maine, provided these clear exemptions and these clear definitions. And for manufacturers of products that will have to adhere to all three of these laws, this consistency will go a long way in making sure that we are fully compliant with all these laws across the state, all states. And secondly, we urge that providing clear definitions for reasonable and foreseeable exposure pathways and applying a real-world kind of litmus test for exposure pathways for how the product is intended to be used by the consumer and looking at when looking at exposure. So I will yield the rest of my time, but again, we thank you, and we look forward to meeting with you guys directly and for you guys looking at our comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe.
Next, we have Carl de Ruiz with Henkel.
Yes, hi, I'm Carl de Ruiz, Henkel, Regulatory Affairs, Research and Development. And I was just interested in knowing, I think there was a comment made briefly during the presentation earlier, that there would be some guidance given with regards to what can be expected in an alternative analysis, excuse me, assessment. And if this is something that's envisioned, when might we see something that would illustrate or provide an example for industry, since there are various levels of capabilities in the small and the larger companies for doing these types of assessments, for such a guidance document to be released and widely available for people to understand how to conduct one of these?
So I have kind of a twofold answer for you. The regulations do require that we provide guidance materials no later than when we issue the first list of priority products. And obviously that set of guidance materials would be directly pertinent to the particular products that are being listed on the first list. In addition to that, though, we already are working with a variety of partners to develop guidance that may be available before that, also to provide examples. And so we are going to be making those available on our website. We've already worked with several people here in the audience on seminars where different manufacturers are sharing with others their experiences already in doing alternatives assessment. So there will be an evolving body of knowledge that we will be making available.
Okay, I would applaud that.
Okay. Next, we have Bob Hamilton with Amway.
Hi, Bob Hamilton. Amway is a large multinational company that provides its product through small independent business owners. So we have an appreciation both for large size commitments and small size ability to respond to those commitments. And so I'd like to address my comments to that specific area. I am involved in our regulatory policy area, and so we look at regulatory policy on a global basis, and we see an increasing amount of responsibility, and that responsibility falls inordinately on small and medium-sized enterprises. We believe that those responsibilities are genuine. They are responsibilities that we need to meet as an industry. However, we appreciate Director Raphael's comment that the regulation be meaningful, practical, and legally defensible. And so we would like to encourage you to consider the amount of effort that you are requiring from industry in responding to this regulation, and to recognize that best, as we learn in industry, is sometimes the enemy of good. And we would like to see this regulation move forward to constantly improve the situation in the state of California. We believe that some of the burdens that might be seen as inordinate on small and medium-sized enterprises are the lack of shared information that was talked about earlier by Paul DeLeo. The fact that within the United States we have very limited capability of sharing information because of stringent antitrust regulation. We're very sensitive to that. We recognize some of the challenges, but this is a brand new area for us. Within the scope of the REACH regulation, they made provisions for this, but those provisions were much more flexible in Europe than they are in the United States, and we'd like to have you consider the difficulty of sharing information without being subject to antitrust litigation. There are also larger, perhaps inordinate burdens that fall to smaller and medium-sized enterprises in the area of monitoring information. I particularly noted because we need to be alert to retailers and their response to regulation. We would, within the scope of your regulation, take the responsibility for our retailers, but there are very small retailers that might be offering products in the marketplace for which they have limited information. They've received it from a distributor, and you would be holding them responsible for a few products on their shelves having to provide information, perhaps a mom and pop grocery. And I think that you ought to at least consider what the impact is for that kind of business at a retail level and for the small and medium-sized chemical companies that might be the resource for truly innovative solutions in the state of California. We would like to also encourage you to consider the prioritization comments that are being made. We feel that you are correct, that industry does look at a fairly extensive list, perhaps 3,000 or more substances that we are concerned about. But we also prioritize those substances so that we know if we're making substitutions, what materials might be substituted for another material in a particular product in order to deliver a true benefit to consumers. Within the state of California, you've not provided a sufficient amount of information for us to make those kinds of decisions, and small and medium-sized enterprises may not have the resources to make those independent decisions, and they may be subject to some surprises as you establish priorities that are different than they anticipated. Also, when there is an alternatives analysis, the assessment that's done by the small and medium-sized enterprise is a major commitment. It's a major effort on their part. They are in competition with others who are doing that same alternatives assessment. And with less resources, with the multiplicity of products, they may be at a significant disadvantage at the end of the day if their alternatives assessment is not acceptable to you, or if that alternatives assessment does not leave them with a competitive product in the marketplace, or if they establish a really effective alternatives assessment but don't get the chance to practice that uniquely because competitors are able to come in very quickly thereafter, and all the investment that they've made is kind of down the drain. Finally, you've asked for a lot of reporting requirements, and those reporting requirements are inordinately borne by those small and medium-sized enterprises that have fewer resources to manage them. We think that those are issues that occur all through the value chain, but particularly they fall on the smaller and medium-sized enterprise. We will have extensive comments that we will submit subsequently, and we do appreciate the opportunity for this public meeting and for the opportunity of all of our comments.
Thank you, Bob.
Next, we have Billy Puck with Recology.
Okay, this is Billy Puck. I'm actually this time not representing any affiliation because that's a strict guidance. I just want to put disclaimer there. So as a private citizen, I have two concerns there. Since we passed the Prop 26 and in your recs on end-of-life management, it talks about administrator a fee to fund the product stewardship program. Is DTSC ready for a challenge? And because Cal Recycle already up in challenge with the carpet regulations. So this is something that, you know, I want to see how DTSC respond to this.
Okay. Sure. That's easy response, actually.
Oh, that's good.
Prop 26 applies to fees imposed by government agencies. We're not imposing a fee through on end of life. It is something that a manufacturer can choose to do if they want to fund their end of life program, but if they did that, that would not be something subject to Prop 65. And I probably should have let my attorney answer this one. Prop 26.
Okay. Okay, second question is on the trade secret requirement. Let's say if a consumer would like to purchase more proprietary green products, and at the end of life, and there's no product stewardship program in place yet, what would the consumer do to consider this product on the end of life? Is it going to be deemed to be hazardous waste, like you talks about in the 69504? Because this first part actually said it will be deemed to be hazardous waste across the board at the end of life.
Well, that refers to products that are hazardous waste under our existing hazardous waste statutes and regulations here in California.
So that would means that if the trade secret, like for example, 7th generation, they always said they're green products, and if they're end of life and it's still a trade secret material, but they claim that it's non-hazardous, how are you going to deem that to be a hazardous waste? That's my question to that.
We're not putting ourselves in the position of deeming anything a hazardous waste. What we're saying is if by operation of the California hazardous waste laws and regulations something is under that regulatory scheme a hazardous waste, then it's eligible for or will be subject to end-of-life requirements. So we're not creating any new status for any chemical. Now, in terms of how do you get at the trade secret information in the product at end of life, it's no different than for any other product. During useful life, the manufacturer may choose to advertise or make available information that it thinks will give it market advantage about why it claims it's non-hazardous, or it can choose not to. These regulations don't really change that, other than if a product has a chemical of concern in it and subject to the alternatives assessment, then as I discussed earlier, they may claim portions of that alternatives assessment report as trade secret, and then the department makes an independent evaluation whether it agrees or not. If we disagree, and there is a Public Records Act request, we have the ability, barring court intervention, to make that information public.
Oh, thank you. That's what I wanted to hear. Thank you very much.
Diana Graham.
I'm Diana Graham, and I'm here as a California resident. And I just thought of this question while I was here and wanted to ask it. Is there any protection for AAs in the sense that if I do an AA and it's accepted by the department and posted on the website, can everyone cite my AA and not have to compensate me for the cost of my costs of having done the AA?
I guess the simple answer to that is yeah. I mean, they would use your AA to submit as their own AA, and no, they would not have to compensate you. However, I mean, if you feel that one or more, that a portion of your AA is subject to trade secret protections, and we agree with you, they would not have access to that portion of it. So it might make it a little difficult for them to just.
So there's an incentive to wait and see what happens otherwise.
Well, are you talking about you've done an AA voluntarily, or you're doing an AA?
No, I'm doing it because I have a product, but I guess I'm just looking at an incentive.
I don't think there's going to be an incentive to wait. I mean, there certainly should be an incentive to comply with the time frames, because there will be penalties for failure to do so.
It comes sort of to the Amway question too, as well. If I have a new technology that's going to give me a market advantage, and you decide that's not really trade secret, but it goes on the website and everybody else can come in and cite my AA and develop the product. I mean, that kind of inspired my question too.
Yeah, I mean, that is a reality.
I want to think about if there's some way that you could protect people with new ideas.
Colleen, do you have anything you want to add? No.
We can look for creative ways, as Odette said and the speaker said, to incentivize early adopters and innovation and advancing the science, but give us some time to think about that.
Okay, we have Melody LaBella with Central Contra Costa Sanitary District and Bay Area Clean Water Agencies.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. My name is Melody LaBella, Regulatory Engineer with Central Contra Costa Sanitary District, a wastewater treatment plant in Martinez. And I'm also here representing the Bay Area Clean Water Agencies. We are 54 publicly owned wastewater treatment plant agencies, primarily in San Francisco Bay Area. We will be following up with written comments, so in case anything I say today isn't clear, hopefully you'll find it there in our written comments. Mostly we're here just to offer our strong support to staff and to compliment you all on this difficult process of writing this regulation. We know this isn't easy. Change on this scale never is. Everything that gets rinsed, flushed, or washed down indoor drains ends up in wastewater treatment plants. We are the proverbial end of the pipe. Being there, we know that source control and not end-of-pipe treatment is always more effective and always less costly. So we spend significant resources on pollution prevention programs. We do great work at our treatment plants, but we do not work magic. Our treatment plants are biological processes. The reality is that we cannot remove dilute concentrations of complex chemicals. So they pass through to the water bodies that we discharge to and can adversely impact the aquatic life there. And by the way, we very much support the current de minimis level and feel it needs to stay right where it's at because we're finding that chemicals are impacting aquatic life at part per trillion levels. For many pollutants that we are concerned about, there is no pollution prevention that we can recommend. We can only monitor for their presence. Until these regulations came along, we were powerless to stop the flow of chemicals of concerns coming to our treatment plants. So to that end, we strongly recommend that the definition section of the regulations needs to be clarified on potential impacts to wastewater treatment and should be broadened to include pass-through, process interference, biosolids end use, effects on aquatic life, including reproductive and developmental. The reality is that the wastewater treatment plant process shifts pollutants from one media to the next. So all the endpoints of the wastewater process needs to be considered in these regulations. And because water quality is such an important factor, we'd like to suggest that the DTSC seek expertise on the list of priority chemicals of concern from the State Water Quality Control Board and the Department of Fish and Game as well. And then just lastly, wanted to ask a question, excuse me. If there's going to be a process for elevating the importance of a chemical of concern so that it could be chosen as one of the 2 to 5 for alternatives assessment, I don't know if that's an open process at all.
Well, the 2 to 5 refers to the product chemical combinations. So it wouldn't actually be elevating a chemical.
Yeah, for any of those, is that going to be like open to?
Oh, definitely. When we're going to come up with a proposed list of product chemical combinations, they'll be put out for public comment, and we'll be considering those.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Appreciate the opportunity.
I have Davis Baltz with Commonweal and Change Coalition.
Thank you. I'm Davis Baltz with Commonweal and also representing the Change Coalition Californians for a Healthy and Green Economy. The first thing I'd like to say is, these regulations are historic in their own way. For the first time, you are trying to regulate based on hazard and not on a full-blown risk assessment. And that's different, and that's new, and that's important. You're building a regulatory structure for the first time that mandates developing an alternatives assessment process. That is new and important. You're addressing cumulative exposure for the first time. This is a key public health concern that you've heard about from environmental justice and other communities for many years. It should be retained in the regulations. And you're requiring the question to be asked early in the process, is this chemical necessary? And this is new also and important for proponents of the use of toxic chemicals to address. Now, all that said, as Odette has pointed out, and I think everyone knows, there's some serious resource constraints that will make this program's output modest, which is all the more reason for DTSC to stake out additional forward-thinking provisions that other regulatory bodies can look to for guidance in the future. So, for example, on de minimis, the informal draft regs have set out a 0.1% level for 9 hazard traits, as well as DTSC's ability to set chemical-specific levels if evidence warrants. This breaks new ground and is important to include if it proves to be in the final regs. But to be scientifically justified, in fact, in many cases, this won't go far enough. It would be inadequate, for example, for a chemical like BPA, which has demonstrated effects at low doses. For BPA, 0.1% would fail to be protective by a few orders of magnitude. Change is consistently maintained throughout the regulation development process that there should be no de minimis level for carcinogens, mutagens, reproductive toxicants, persistent bioaccumulative toxins, or endocrine disruptors. And while we will still debate among ourselves what our final language will be, I think we can certainly say that we will continue to advocate for that. There should be no de minimis level for CMRs, PBTs, or endocrine disruptors. The proposed large chemical of concern list is another important provision that has our support. As you've noted, it sends a market signal that presumably will prompt voluntary action before regulation. This is smart. And it could go further by requiring more information earlier in the process. For example, supply chain information before the final alternatives assessment. Let's provide that earlier in the process to get more information that's useful to downstream users of chemicals out into the public sphere so that they can use it to make better decisions. After all, the entities that are going to have the first level of responsibility are often downstream users of chemicals. They're toy manufacturers, they're consumer product manufacturers. They have a vested interest in knowing what is going into their products. Now, on the issue of chemicals with little or no information, the regs are silent on that. And they say, actions will be based on having reliable and available information. But let's remember the market is not working to the degree that it could because not enough information is available. The more we know, the better the market will work. And the regulation should somehow flag chemicals with insufficient information, sort of a yellow flag, if you will, so that it will stimulate the market to produce that information. So finally, on a specific issue, 69508.1A5, this starts on page 60, line 36. It's concerning the qualifications for accreditation bodies. The draft regs say that the accreditation body must have the ability and experience to teach one or more of, and it lists 14 skill sets of professional expertise. I feel it would be better if the department requires more than simply one of these areas. And in particular, should be one of the three that's listed: pollution prevention, public health, or maternal and child health. One of those should be required, and an additional one or more from the rest of the list. As they're written now, someone with experience as a risk assessor only, but nothing else on the list, would be eligible. And this goes counter to the intent of this regulation, which is to regulate on hazard. So thanks again for the chance to comment. And like everyone else, we'll be submitting more detailed comments by the end of the month.
Thank you, Davis.
Okay, I have 6 more cards. Dorothy Wigmore with WorkSafe and Change.
Yes, my name is Dorothy Wigmore. I'm an occupational hygienist and do other kinds of work in occupational health with WorkSafe, which is a statewide worker health and safety advocacy organization. And we also are members of Change, the coalition for which Davis just spoke. I just want to particularly draw attention to some of the things that have to do with worker health. And I think just to sort of reiterate what Davis said, and this may be partly because of my Canadian background, I'm really conscious that the world is watching what's happening here. And so it's really important that not only that you do what you can, but you aspire to as much as is possible, I think. Be bold, I think, is some advice you've been given in other situations. And I think that it's not just industry that's keeping tabs on what's going on, but that people are concerned about the environment and workers' health. And as someone who's been involved in this field for many years, and as a woman who's been involved in this field for many years, I'm really conscious that workers' health extends past the workers themselves to their ability to have healthy children. So things like endocrine disruptors and mutagens and reproductive chemicals that affect reproductive health are very much on the mind of many workers. The word ketone might come to mind for people in this state. So in terms of being an occupational health specialist, and particularly one that uses a public health perspective, I just want to reiterate my understanding of green chemistry, which is that it's about hazards. It's not about risk assessments. And that's what the law says here, and certainly that's what the grandfathers, as I like to think of them, of green chemistry, have defined green chemistry as about the inherent hazards. So if we're going to deal with hazards, we have to include workers, because workers are the ones that actually make these consumer products, and they wouldn't exist without the folks that extract things from the ground all the way to deal with the end of life. And as I read through the regulations, it was really unclear, despite what appeared to be an intention to include them, where they are included. The other reason to, if you're taking the sort of life cycle approach, I'd argue you have to think a little bit more about and be more explicit about where workers are included in this. The other thing is that workers use consumer products on the job. Just because something's called a consumer product doesn't mean that it stays in a, it's in a home. It's used by a lot of workers, and I'll be talking to some of them on Wednesday about green chemistry who use cleaning products as one example. So one of the suggestions that I have is that you might want to follow the definition of public health that's used by the American Public Health Association that would include worker health. And so you don't have to, because public health keeps on being mentioned over and over in the regs. Another thing that's important in terms of worker health is that all, and I would argue everyone's health, is that all routes of entry are covered and not just inhalation and dermal. The question that I think Anna referred to earlier about products that are being made here for use elsewhere not being covered, that's certainly an issue for workers. One of the things that I just sort of thought about, one of my experiences with some cleaning products and looking at one of the definition around the function and performance of principal uses as intended. Principal uses are, and even things that are ways that products are intended to be used, is not always the way they're used. And that doesn't mean that those supplying them or those making them don't know this is happening. And I would offer one quick example of a company that was supposed to be selling a cleaning product or floor stripping product with a particular machine, and was more than happy to sell it to the school board that I was working with, just the product on its own without the cleaning machine, knowing full well this was not how the product was intended to be used. I don't know how often that happens, but you can't assume that just because there are intended uses and principal uses that that's really what happens in everyday life. And I would, I guess the other thing that I was concerned about is when you get to the guidance and the documents, that whether it's for consumers or workers or for industry in general, that in section 69, 506.3b, that language be considered, and particularly the use of clear or plain language, so that people actually understand what it is you want them to understand. And finally, I think I'd reiterate what a number of others have said. I know you're setting yourselves up to do a lot, and there is a huge issue of resources here that we're conscious of from the outside as well, and trying to figure out what that means. And I'm bringing this up not to say that you should stop doing, or not to say that you should think boldly, but that I think that it's really important for you to be asking those of us outside what we can do to help you get more resources so you can do the right thing.
Thank you, Dorothy.
Andrea Ventura with Clean Water Action.
Hi, thank you for this opportunity, as always, to make comment on these regulations. Again, I also want to thank you for all of the hard work for a number of years now that you've been putting into trying to develop these regs. I am Andrea Ventura. I'm with Clean Water Action. We are an environmental group with approximately 85,000 members here in California. And I want to just focus in on a couple of things, or a couple of quick recommendations or comments, and one question. I want to reiterate something that came up when Melody Labella spoke about the impacts on water, and in her case in water, but on the environment. One of the things that we laud in these proposed regs is the fact that you have laid out very clearly environmental endpoints that need to be considered, as well as in your lists of chemicals, environmentally based lists of chemicals of concern. That's very clear. We appreciate that. But I am a little concerned that as we over the years have been talking about this, we do put a great deal of emphasis on health endpoints when we talk about prioritizing what are those actual chemical and product combinations that are going to be prioritized and that we can start working on. And there is a concern that sometimes faced with very clear and acute public health endpoints, environmental endpoints kind of get shunted as less of a priority. And that's sometimes because they're harder to define, or they're much broader based, and it's harder sometimes to measure. But in fact, we think that we need to address this issue. First of all, we support, one thing that we do think that will help with this is that you do have a robust list of chemicals of concern, and we encourage you to stick with that. The reason being that one of the problems in the environment is that as we address particular problems that we know about, that have been out there for a long time, what we're finding, though, is that we can't keep up on what are called the emerging contaminants. This is something the wastewater agencies and the stormwater agencies and the drinking water agencies are dealing with every day, that there is this ever-ending list of problems, of chemicals that we are just finding out about that have environmental impacts and or health impacts, and we don't necessarily fully understand them yet, but they're turning into major problems. The other point, of course, is that sometimes if we're so focused on, say, dermal or inhalation exposures to health, we're talking about the actual use of a product, that may have a minimal health effect. But when large amounts of those chemicals start to collect in the environment, as through drinking, in drinking water, or contaminating fish tissue, where we've got, thousands upon thousands of subsistence fishers out there depending on fish that have PCBs and mercury and other chemicals that have gotten there from human use, that in fact those health impacts can be much larger than just the individual use of a product. So 2 recommendations to deal with this. One is that, and you heard a little bit about this with Melody's comments, while it's clear that other environmental sister agencies and government agencies dealing with environmental problems can certainly petition DTSC to prioritize a particular chemical or product line, that doesn't mean that they're going to make it first on the list either. And so what we would actually ask to see somewhat codified in the regs is that perhaps a percentage, if you're only doing 2 to 5 products, maybe it's 1 product line, but at least a percentage comes from recommendations from your sister agencies that do not have the authority to regulate chemicals in products. The water boards would be one example of that. So that's one recommendation we would make. The other thing comes on something that we've talked about at Clean Water Action a lot. We certainly think that looking at exposure, whether it's exposure to human beings or exposure by the environment, as a way to prioritize where we're going to start. I do want to remind you that in our view, containing a chemical, when you're doing an alternatives analysis, containing a chemical of concern does not take it out of commerce. And the idea of containing it so people that are using that product are not exposed and trying to deal with it at the end of the life, that to us is not an ultimate solution to a chemical concern in a product. That is containment. That doesn't work. We've got experience after experience of how these things do get out there, do cause exposures, and we would not like to see that as a final alternative or regulatory response. We would oppose that. Finally, one last question, and it has to do with the issue of trade secrets. We know that certainly DTSC is limited by current law as to, you know, being able to require or to, better yet, to limit trade secret protections when we need more information about identity of chemicals. However, is DTSC planning, when they're evaluating trade secret claims from companies, to look to see not only if a competitor has back engineered a product, or, you know, sometimes public interest groups have done that as well in their efforts to, you know, notify the public that there are certain things in products they may be using. They may not do it by company, but they may do it by product line. Lead in lipstick is an example that comes to mind. Is DTSC considering looking at what the public interest community has done already to get information out there about chemicals in products?
Well, briefly, as you can imagine, we're bound by the regulations as to what we will look at to justify or to rebut a claim of trade secret protection. So to the extent it's implicit in any of the stated factors in the regulations, we would consider that. But short of that, you would have to suggest that we amend the draft regulations to explicitly call out reverse engineering that's been done to make public something that wasn't otherwise public. And then we would entertain that suggestion, but we would entertain it against the backdrop of, does it fit within the rubric, the general rules of trade secret?
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrea.
I have a few more. Catherine Alcantar, Center for Environmental Health and Change Coalition.
First of all, I just wanted to say good afternoon and thank you all for your hard work on really improving the draft informal regs from last year's version. We're all really excited about it. Again, I am Catherine Alcantar. I am the California Policy Director for Center for Environmental Health, a member of the Change Coalition, Californians for a Healthy and Green Economy. And the Center for Environmental Health, our goal is to protect people from toxic chemicals and promote business practices that are safe for public health and the environment. And so I want to just, there's a few comments I have. Some of them might be a little bit repetitious, so I'll try to trim those as needed. First and foremost, we appreciate the department providing, in respect to the chemicals of concern, a much larger list than I think maybe what you've heard today. Some concerns about that being a long list, and we would actually disagree. We actually think that this list it represents only a small portion of all of the chemicals that are in use today and on the market, and so we really feel like this is a prioritized list of chemicals of concern, and appreciate the department's willingness to send that signal out to the market so that we can get a good jump start on this innovation, which was one of the goals of the Green Chemistry Initiative. Secondly, with respect to the product prioritization, we really feel strongly that the categories are much too narrow. And given that it takes so much time, as you've heard today from industry, to complete alternatives assessment, perhaps if you were to develop a phased-in, prioritized list of products, a larger list than just the 2 to 5, as you mentioned, that might both send a signal to the market as well as give industry more time and advance notice to get started on alternatives assessment processes. This would also help alleviate public concern that the program is too narrow or that it doesn't do enough. Thirdly, on de minimis, while we think the department has taken good strides towards the better protection of human health and the environment with the revised de minimis standard and a reduced level of 0.01% by weight, we still believe that there should be no de minimis for PBTs, endocrine disruptors, or CMRs. And a number of reasons for that include, one, it's kind of an embodiment of that, you know, the 0.01% by weight is an embodiment of the old saying that the solution to pollution is dilution, because all you need to do is increase another component that outweighs it, and you can bring up the weight, and that percentage goes down. Two, from a scientific basis, that has been mentioned a couple of times today, there is scientific evidence actually supports that some of these chemicals can have impacts at extremely low levels, and not just in human health, but as mentioned today, in the environment. And thirdly, limited resource issues. You know, going through the regs, I mean, that's one thing that we really recognize is how limited the department's resources are. And therefore, we think that it just makes much more sense to have the limited time and resources available, not to have to go through and have the department determine what another level should be. While we like that cause, we feel like having a no de minimis level for certain chemicals makes much better sense. And there's actually precedent for this, that recently Maine and Washington regulations have actually said that there should be no de minimis for intentionally added chemicals. And for me personally, this is a big issue because I am pregnant and I have a background in toxicology. So I do understand that this is, that there can be very, very low doses can cause significant impacts in very vulnerable populations, in particular the fetus and young children. Another comment that I had that we have is on the issue of to the question that was raised earlier on the phasing out of chemicals and DTSC's plan for a secret shopper program. Well, I think that's a really innovative program, the secret shopper program, I should say, specifically to make sure that products that are being phased out or the chemicals and products that are being phased out aren't dumped into dollar stores and other like low-income communities, which are also vulnerable communities. And I think that's a creative approach. It's one that actually my organization does on a regular basis to help enforce the Prop 65. We continually test products, especially children's products, for lead. And despite the years of having that on the books, we still today find lead in children's products. And so in line with the point of these regulations being meaningful and functioning well, we suggest that that there be a strong regulatory structure and some good guidelines for in the regulatory criteria to ensure that these products are prevented from being dumped. Because again, given the limited resources that DTSC has, having a secret shopper program on top of all the other things that you need to do can be very resource intensive, and we definitely have evidence of that from our own work. And we'll be, in general, and as we've had conversations before, we feel that having some more guidelines or criteria around the regulatory responses is needed, and we'll be submitting some more specific comments for that. But that was just one issue I wanted to highlight because it came up in the question today. With that, I think I just wanted to say there was a couple other things. We'll be submitting final comments to you. But I just wanted to, like my colleagues,
sort of remind DTSC that part of the goals of the Green Chemistry Initiative are to stimulate the innovation, and so to reiterate and encourage the DTSC to be bold and to think big, because this is historic and the world is watching.
Thank you, Catherine.
I know I said 6 a long time ago, but I have 5 more cards at this point. Gretchen Lee Salter with Breast Cancer Fund.
Great, thanks so much. Thank you very much for the opportunity to comment. I'll echo what I think most people have said today. I really have appreciated all the work that DTSC has put into this process over the last 3 years, and has really allowed us to give you our comments, and has taken a lot of that feedback back and really thought thoroughly about it. So I really thank you for your thoughtfulness. And I applaud you on the most current draft. I think it is a huge step in the right direction. It's a vast improvement over previous drafts, and I think we are starting to go in the right direction on a couple of different areas. First of all, I think the list of chemicals of concern is comprehensive and thorough. And while a number of other commenters today have remarked on the fact that it's 3,000 or 4,000 chemicals, when you have 80 to 100,000 chemicals registered for use in commerce, this is a very small percentage of the chemicals that are actually out there. So I agree with my colleagues who said that this is already a prioritized list, and we would encourage you to keep the lists of lists that are there. And the fact of the matter is that a lot of the chemicals that are on the market are hazardous. And just because there are 3,000 or 4,000 of them that are hazardous isn't enough of a reason not to have them listed as a chemical of concern. A couple of things I wanted to go over, though, in my testimony here. I'd like to talk about the alternatives analysis, a little bit about de minimis, and finally about regulatory responses. So first, on the alternatives analysis piece, I'm a little bit unclear on how DTSC is going to ensure reliability if they're conducted by a manufacturer who has a vested interest in the status quo. While I appreciate that there is going to be some sort of certification program, I think it is very easy for an alternatives analysis that is very subjective to be gamed in some way, shape, or form. And especially when it's going to be conducted by a manufacturer who is using toxic chemicals, especially when we're talking 10 years down the line when a COC list has been published for a number of years and they're still using a chemical that's on that list. This is a manufacturer that's very vested in keeping things the way that they are. And I and my colleagues at the Breast Cancer Fund remain very, very concerned that alternatives assessments could be gamed very easily. And if DTSC is the only one conducting the audits, then that severely limits the number of product chemical combinations that could be prioritized or put on the list. We have consistently recommended that there be third-party alternatives assessments or third-party verification at a very minimum be done to ensure reliability. It would also take the burden off of DTSC to go through and audit all of the different alternatives assessments. You've remarked a couple times today and throughout the last year, or couple of years in fact, on the very limited resources that DTSC has. And I thought one of the great things about the previous regs was the third-party verification, so that it would take some of the burden off of DTSC from having to audit so many of the AAs. I was disappointed to see that piece of it gone from the regulations, and I would ask you to go back and rethink that, or rethink some way to make sure that the alternatives assessments are actually giving reliable information. Secondly, I wanted to talk a little bit about the regulatory responses. My colleague at Center for Environmental Health, Catherine Alcantara, brought this up just a minute ago, but I don't see very clear criteria for when a regulatory response is going to be taken. I think the criteria there is a little bit vague, and I think we can provide you with some good criteria, good language on criteria, but I would just caution that while I think it's good that DTSC is providing itself with some sort of flexibility, there's also then the lack of predictability that comes with that flexibility. And so I think in some cases we're going to want very clear criteria as to when a chemical needs to be, for instance, taken off the market, or when it needs to be labeled, and that criteria isn't quite there. I think that it's not quite clear enough and could be better defined. Lastly, I want to reiterate a lot of what my other colleagues have said as well about the de minimis. While I think it is very much improved, and I really do appreciate the fact that DTSC is trying to make this a little bit more scientific, I was struck by one of the comments that Director Rafael said in her video, that the 0.1% for all chemicals wasn't scientific, so you went just 0.01% for all chemicals, and that too isn't necessarily scientific, nor is it in the best interest of public health. I do appreciate that DTSC will have the ability to choose a lower or higher de minimis standard based on its own discretion. But again, I think there needs to be some sort of predictability there. And also that's going to be it could be potentially resource intensive for you. So I reiterate what a lot of my change colleagues have said, thank you, and say that for certain chemicals that are endocrine disruptors, carcinogens, mutagens, reproductive toxins, PBTs, should have no de minimis level whatsoever. And that for other chemicals there needs to be a lower de minimis level set, because while 0.1% or 0.01% may seem like it's very low, when you add up all those chemicals in wastewater, in seawater, in soil, it actually could add up to a very real public health threat. So with that, I think my time is nearly up. I thank you again for allowing us to comment, and wish you best of luck in the next couple of months. Thanks.
Thank you, Gretchen.
Bob Swigger with Stoner Incorporated.
Good afternoon. I'm Bob Swigger, and I'm a senior R&D scientist at Stoner Incorporated. Stoner is a small, privately owned specialty chemical manufacturer. And we certainly support the Green Chemistry Initiative and the actions of the DTSC. We thank you for all your hard work in this comprehensive regulations, and we appreciate the opportunity to speak and have some feedback. Many of the thoughts and concerns that we have already been stated today, so I'll be brief. And we will be following up with some written comments in the near future. Basically, the concerns that I'd like to highlight are twofold. One is that we're concerned that the list of the COCs is too broad and will impose a heavy burden on manufacturers, especially the smaller manufacturers such as Stoner. We support narrowing the list of chemicals to a much more manageable number. This will allow us to address them in a timely and very much in an effective manner. Number two, we believe that the process outlined for the trade secret information is complicated. We would encourage the DTSC to consider making this process straightforward so that information such as formulas will be able to be considered trade secreted information. As a small manufacturer, trade secrets are certainly what allow us to remain in business and to gain a competitive edge. So the trade secret is certainly a significant concern for us. Thank you again for the time to speak, and we look forward to continuing the feedback process.
Just very briefly, just so you know, the formulas are not called out by name as things that are per se trade secrets, but the statute that you see incorporated by reference to the Public Records Act expressly provides that trade secrets may include but are not limited to, and there's a laundry list, and formulas are expressly included. Okay. So it's going to be fact specific, as I've said before, but they're certainly in the realm of consideration for trade secret treatment.
Yeah, it's just something I wanted to highlight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, I have Teresa Bowie with California Against Waste.
Good afternoon. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. My name is Teresa Bowie with Californians Against Waste. We are interested in the end-of-life management requirement, and I noticed that it was not covered during the slide, so I was hoping you can give more clarification on the applicability of the end-of-life management, especially in regards to what is the mechanism to ensure that the manufacturers set a high enough recycling goal as part of their plan, and what is DTSC's oversight role and enforcement role to make sure that the stewardship plan or the manufacturers achieve their targets?
I don't think that we plan to dictate a recycling goal. And in terms of oversight, we do require the plans to be submitted to us and the information be posted on the manufacturer's website in addition to our own. And we require reports from manufacturers on their implementation of all regulatory responses.
Okay, I have Brenda Coleman from California Chamber of Commerce.
Good afternoon, Brenda Coleman here with the California Chamber of Commerce. Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak before you today. First off, I'd just like to say that we echo the concerns that have already been raised by GCA and several others from the business community. We too support and would like to see the green chemistry program succeed. However, if this is to be an efficacious program and one that can serve as a true national model, then there are several issues within the reg that must be addressed. First, something that has already been expressed is the concern of the expansive COC list. Such an expansive list creates uncertainty and will ultimately impede innovation and technology. So we ask that you take a look at such a large list. Second, as relayed in the questions that I submitted to you that you addressed earlier today, there's a definitive process outlined in the reg for adding a chemical to the COC list, but clearly absent is the process for the removal of a chemical. So we hope to see that this is clarified in the reg as we move forward. Also missing from the process to add a chemical is the notification, or is the process that invokes public notification and participation. There needs to be a more efficient and effective process aside from just posting to businesses on your website for alerting the public of the process in which to add a chemical to the COC list. Third, with a membership comprised of over 75% small businesses, we'd like to know what considerations and flexibilities will be given, if any, to the businesses that do not necessarily have the resources and or the infrastructure that some of the larger companies have. Several of these businesses will have to contract out several of the processes that are required in the reg, which will result in added cost and potential timing issues if they are to meet the newly tightened timeline for submissions. Finally, and very importantly, is the economic impact of all of the requirements upon the entities. Such economic impacts must be given consideration throughout the process, especially in light of our economic state. It is important to have a metric that measures and considers these impacts throughout the entire process and every step of the way in order to mitigate any further cost on all entities. Again, we support the goals of the Green Chemistry Initiative, and we hope that these issues and others that we will be commenting on at the end of the month will be given consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda.
The last card I have is from Paul DeLeo, American Cleaning Institute.
Wait a sec. I want to be fair to everybody before we, because you already came up and spoke, right? So, okay. So we will definitely get to you, Paul. But is there anybody else who's not spoken already who has submitted a card? No. Okay. What we're gonna do real quickly is, I've got a couple of questions that came in by email, so I'm going to address those very quickly, and then I'm going to ask those of you who want to get up a second time to line up, and I would say that Paul's at the head of the line. Okay, so so this question comes from, I hope I say this correctly, Sudeep Rayo with Beautiful Communities. So the questions are, will DTSC conduct training and certify assessors? And the answer to that is no, that this would be done by the accreditation bodies that DTSC would designate. Second question, what is the timeline for such training of assessors? And I think the best answer to that is that we recognize it's going to take time for these accreditation programs to get in place. And so we've delayed implementation of the requirement for certified assessors to conduct the AAs until January 2015. Then we have an email here from John Sharp of Triquint Semiconductors. Hello, I'm watching the webcast, hearing, and would like to offer a comment on some of the concerns. I believe that DTSC really needs to look carefully at how the entire REACH process works, as both of these regulations are working in the same areas, both market-wise and desired outcome-wise. And so I just want to mention one thing. So there's not a question, but I do feel the need to respond. We are looking very carefully at REACH. I know my staff spends a lot of time doing that. And there is a lot for us to learn there in terms of identifying chemicals. But I do want to make a slight clarification that there is a significant difference between what REACH is doing and what these regulations are doing. And the biggest difference there is the emphasis on alternatives assessment. That is not something that is being done as part of REACH or as part of any other program. So that's a distinction we always keep in mind when we're talking about, does it make sense to be consistent with REACH, or is what we're doing different enough that we need to rethink that? So John Sharp goes on to say, as to the speaker's concerns about developing an AA, then DTSC posting it so that others could take advantage of her company's work, the obvious solution is to form substance information exchange forms where only companies that are members of the SIEF, the abbreviation, can use the data developed by SIEF members. If someone comes along after the data was developed, they have to buy their way in for compensating other SIEF members for their previous expenditures. It also gets industry members to work together, pooling resources so that many hands can make light work. So that's, you know, an interesting comment, and we've heard other suggestions about that before, so it's something that we'll look into it. I'm not sure that it's precluded under the way the regulations are written, but we'll certainly take a look. So I do have one other comment that came in earlier, but it's really long, and so it probably would take me at least 5 minutes to read. So before we get to that, I wanted to give anybody else who's actually here in the room the opportunity to come up, form a line, and comment, starting with Paul.
Thanks, Odette. I just had a quick clarifying question on the petition process. What I heard you say, just correct me if I didn't understand it correctly, you'd be collecting the petitions and making decisions on the petitions as a group because you would be doing periodic listing, and so if you were making affirmative decisions on them, they would all be potentially listed at one time as opposed to in real time, one by one listing them. Did I understand that correctly?
Well, I don't think I was that specific, and this is probably something that we're going to have to learn as we go through, but I doubt that we would, you know, get through the process where we approve a petition, say, okay, we're going to look at that next time. I don't think that would necessarily trigger us to immediately go into the next prioritization process. Right. I think for efficiency purposes, we'd say, okay, these petitions are approved. Next time we get around to doing changes to the list, we will look at the chemical or the product that's been petitioned.
Okay, great, thank you.
Davis?
Davis Baltz again with Commonweal and Change. This is concerning the definitions, and I notice specifically on economic impacts. And in the definition section, early in the regulations, the definition that's currently included does not include any cost to families, the environment, or public health. And I think these should be included, especially since when we get to the final AA report, some of the required language that I actually like quite a lot is the responsible entities evaluation and comparison of economic impact shall take into account both internalized and externalized costs during the life cycle of the priority product, and shall also, the externalized costs shall include costs to government agencies, the public, business, and consumers. So there needs to be some synchronization of what is meant by economic impacts, and we would, of course, ask for the broader definition so that all costs to society would be included.
Okay. Thank you, Davis. Anybody else? Nope. Okay, for those of you who want to stay, I am going to read this email that we received this morning into the record. Comes, hope I pronounced this one correctly, Jeff Brozu, I believe. Jeff is with the California Stormwater Quality Association. So, on behalf of the California Stormwater Quality Association, thank you for the opportunity to comment on these proposed regulations, which are vital to protecting water quality. Additionally, reducing or eliminating pollutants at their origin through mechanisms such as safer consumer product regulations is by far the most effective and efficient method for reducing the impacts of many, if not most, stormwater pollutants. Virtually every municipality in California is under a National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit issued by the state under the Federal Clean Water Act. The basic charge of stormwater quality management agencies under these permits is to reduce the discharge of pollutants via runoff into our receiving waters. There are two general categories of best management practices to accomplish this charge: source and treatment controls. Source controls work by keeping potential pollutants out of stormwater, while the other major category of BPMs, treatment controls, by removing potential pollutants once they are in stormwater. Most source controls are operational, focused on physically keeping potential pollutants out of contact with rainfall and stormwater runoff through covering, berming, or cleaning at commercial, industrial, and public facilities and in the public right-of-way and on roads. True source control, a subset of source controls, focuses on the original source of a potential pollutant by eliminating or significantly reducing the existence of the potential pollutant, thereby negating the need to physically prevent contact with rain or runoff. There are few viable treatment control options for many of the chemicals listed as impairing California's waters. For many of these chemicals that are highly soluble and widely responsible for impairment of receiving waters, true source control is the only currently available option to meet our water quality goals by complying with receiving water standards without widespread and substantial economic impact. The focus of most true source control efforts to date has been human-made products. Products are natural for true source control because their source is clear and finite. For example, a company, a factory. Many times it is not the product per se that is the problem, but a particular form of the product or a particular ingredient in the product. This fact lends itself to product substitution, in which substitute forms or ingredients are designed, developed, and then promoted or required to be used. Clearly, green chemistry and true source control are the same basic environmental strategy, and as stated on the CalEP website in reference to green chemistry, they represent a fundamentally new approach to environmental protection, transitioning away from managing toxic chemicals at the end of the life cycle to reducing or eliminating their use altogether. Given the vital nature of safer consumer product regulations to water quality protection, the California Stormwater Quality Association has the following brief comments today. 1. Funding. DTSC currently does not have sufficient resources to implement the regulations at a level necessary to respond to problems from products. DTSC will need funding to conduct the analyses. Stormwater quality agencies believe that this funding should come from the private companies that have interests in the products. 2. Lack of funding. If DTSC does not obtain sufficient funding to implement the regulations, stormwater quality agencies may seek help from legislation on products. 3. Definitions. The definitions section needs clarification on potential water quality impacts. For example, effects on aquatic life like reproduction and development, and potential NPDES violations. The current definitions are too narrow. 4. Outside expertise. DTSC needs to have technical expertise from the Water Board and Fish and Game closely involved as DTSC crafts the regulations. Thank you again for the opportunity to provide comments at today's workshop. We will provide details and recommendations on our brief comments as well as additional comments in writing by the December 30th deadline. So, Sue, do we have any other email comments or comment cards? They're just checking my work. So I believe that concludes today's hearing. I want to thank all of you for coming and sitting with us. I know it's been a long little over 5.5 hours. I appreciate the time you've spent with us and sharing your thoughts and questions with us, and I hope that you will continue to stay engaged with us, not only during the review of the informal draft regulations, but as we move on to the formal APA process, which will start February-ish. And again, remember to please submit your written comments, including, wherever possible, specific suggested language solutions. And again, the email address is gcregs@dtsc.ca.gov. And so, is there anything else any of you would like to say? Have I forgotten anything? With that, we are adjourned for the day. Thank you.